Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. You saw the photograph. I know you did, because everybody did. August 15th, a Saturday afternoon at Arrowhead Stadium, first preseason game of the year against the Rams. Travis on the sideline in uniform, and on his left hand, plain as anything, a gold wedding band. It went everywhere inside of about 4 minutes. People wrote about it. Somebody made it a whole piece. Players do not wear rings on a field. It is not done. There are practical reasons. And here was a 36-year-old tight end, standing on the Arrowhead grass with his wedding ring on his finger, like a man who had forgotten to take it off. He had not forgotten. Every single article I read about that ring said some version of the same thing. How sweet, newlyweds, he cannot bear to take it off. 7 weeks married and still glowing. All of that is true, and all of it is about 4% of it. Nobody asked the actual question. Nobody asked where he had been. Here is what I can tell you, and then I am going to spend the next 40 minutes telling you the whole thing, because it is the best story I have about my son, and I have been sitting on it for a week, and it is starting to leak out of me. On the afternoon of Thursday, August 13th, Travis Kelce finished a training camp practice at Missouri Western State University in St. Joseph, Missouri. There was no practice scheduled for Friday the 14th. The next thing on his calendar was a 3 o'clock kickoff on Saturday the 15th at Arrowhead. That is a window. It is not a big window, but it is a window, and it was the only one in the entire summer, and my son found it. Between Thursday afternoon and Saturday morning, Travis Kelce was not in Missouri. He was not in Kansas City. He was not, in fact, on this continent. He was gone for about 38 hours. 18 of them were in the air. 14 of them were somewhere else. And then he came back and put on a uniform and stood on a field in front of 70,000 people with a gold ring on his hand, and every camera in that stadium found the ring, and not one single human being on this earth asked the obvious question. 3 people know. Me, Jason, Kylie. That is the whole list, and I want to be honest about how each of us found out, because none of us were told at the time, and 2 of us were not told at all. Jason knows because somebody had to be able to answer a phone if the wrong thing happened. Kylie knows because Jason cannot keep anything from that woman for more than about 9 hours, which is the single best quality he has, and which Kylie will confirm. And I know because I asked him a question on Sunday the 16th about something completely unrelated, and my son, who has never successfully lied to me in 36 years, went silent for 4 seconds. 4 seconds is all it has ever taken. So, that is what this is. I am going to tell you where Travis Kelce went on August 14th, 2026. I am going to tell you what it took to arrange, which was more than you think and less than you think, in different ways. I am going to tell you what happened when a door opened at 6 in the morning in a city 4,000 miles from a football field, and I am going to tell you what my daughter-in-law said afterward, to me, on the telephone, 3 days later, in a voice I have only heard from her twice. And at the end, I am going to tell you the one part of it that I think is actually the point, which has nothing to do with airplanes, and which took me about a week to work out. Sit with me. Part 1. The state of him. Let me back up to the last week of July, because the thing that happened on August 14th did not start on August 14th. Travis reported to training camp on July 29th. He had been married for 26 days. I have talked elsewhere about the morning after the wedding, the 4:53 in the morning phone call, the note written 3 times, the alarm turned off so it would not wake her. That was July 4th, and he got on a plane that day, and after that it was camp. Camp at Missouri Western State University is a real camp in the old sense. The players live in the dormitories. Cinder block, fluorescent light under the door, a twin bed that is too short for a man who is 6 feet 5 inches tall. He has done it 14 times. He told me in August that the first 13 were fine. He said, It's just a room. You're so tired you don't care. He said, it wasn't fine this year. I said, why not? And he said, because I'd never had anything to miss before. I want to say something about that because I think it is the honest engine of this entire story, and I do not want anybody to think this was a romantic gesture in the greeting card sense. My son was not being sweet. My son was in a state. He was 36 years old, in a dormitory, in the middle of what might be the last training camp of his life, with a left knee that has not been entirely right since 2023, and he had been married for 4 weeks and had spent almost none of it in the same building as his wife. And he was not handling it well. He was handling the football fine. He had a good camp. Andy Reid said so out loud to Jason on the 19th, and Andy Reid does not say things to be nice. He was not handling the other part. The phone calls tell you. They talk every day. They have not missed a day since July 4th. I have talked about the rules elsewhere. There are 4 of them written on a card, and one of them is that they talk every single day no matter what. They have kept it. Every day. But in the first week of August, the calls got worse. Not shorter, worse. He told me about it, and later she told me about it, and both of their accounts are identical, which is how I know it is true. He said, we were doing them at her bedtime for a while, so I'd be sitting in a locker room at 4 in the afternoon, still in my gear, saying goodnight to my wife, and then I'd have 6 hours of my own day left and go to bed alone with no goodnight because we'd already done it. So around day 9, he switched it to his bedtime, which meant she was getting a phone call at 4:30 in the morning her time, every night, for 17 straight days. She picked up every single time sounding completely awake. She never once mentioned it. He found out on August 7th, and when he found out, he said 3 words to her that I want to put in front of you because they are the seed of everything that happened a week later. He said, I'm not asking. Part 2. The 7th, August 7th, is the other date you need. That Friday afternoon at camp, my son took a hard hit. A defensive back named Melvin Smith Jr. broke up a pass and Travis went down and did not get up right away. Somebody had a phone. 11 seconds of video went around the world. The team said there was no damage, which was true. He practiced the next day. He is fine, and has been fine ever since. But I have talked about this elsewhere, and I will say the short version here. He got up in a specific way that I recognized from September of 2023, and so did his wife, from 4,000 miles away, and she called me 2 hours later and did not say hello. She said, how did he get up? Here is the part I did not tell in that story. I did not tell it because at the time I did not know it. Travis called me on the night of the 8th, the day after the hit, after he had practiced, after he had proven the point he needed to prove. And he was not talking about his knee. He said, Mom, she was up. I said, what? He said, on the 7th. When that thing happened, it was 4 in the afternoon here, so it was late evening there, and she called you, and then she called me, and we talked for a while. He said, and then I found out later she didn't sleep. He said, she was awake all night in another country because a video came out of me lying in some grass in Missouri, and there was nothing she could do, and there was nothing I could do about there being nothing she could do. Long silence on that phone. And then my son said, I hate this. I want to describe the specific quality of how he said that, because Travis Kelce complains constantly, and this was not complaining. Travis complains about referees. He complains about weather. He complains about a specific brand of protein bar in a way that has become a running item in this family. He does not say, I hate this. He said it flat and quiet, like a man reporting a fact he has been trying to argue himself out of and has failed. I said, Travis. And he said, no, I know. I know it's the deal. I signed a contract. She's got her thing. I'm not asking anybody to feel bad for me. He said, I just, She was awake all night and I couldn't get to her. He said, "What's the point of any of it if I can't get to her?" I did not say anything useful. I want that on the record because I have told a great many stories in these videos where I said the right thing at the right moment, and I want it to be clear that I do not always. I said something about how it is only a few weeks, and the season starts soon, and they will figure out a rhythm, which is true, and which is completely useless, and which he did not want. He said, "Yeah," and we talked about something else, and hung up. 6 days later, he was in another country. Part 3. Where she was. Now I have to tell you where Taylor was, because the timing of this is not an accident, and I do not want anybody to think my son made a wild romantic dash into the unknown. He knew exactly where she was. He is her husband. They talk every day. She was in London. She had gone for work and she had stayed for a wedding. 2 recording engineers she has worked with for years, people who have been in rooms with her at 3 in the morning trying to get a vocal right. Their wedding was that week. On the night of Wednesday the 12th into Thursday the 13th, she went out. A girls' night. She was photographed leaving Annabelle's in a purple floral dress with her wedding ring on and a haircut she had gotten that same afternoon on about 4 hours' notice. That was her first public appearance since her own wedding on July 3rd. The internet went completely sideways about it. New era. Wifey era. TS13. First married look. All of it. Every single one of those pieces was written on Thursday the 13th, which is the day my son finished a practice at 9:15 in the morning in Missouri, and did not have anything on his schedule until Saturday afternoon. Part 4. The arithmetic. I want to walk you through the numbers, because when Travis explained it to me on the 18th, he explained it exactly like this, with the same flat precision he uses when he is describing a root concept, and it was the first moment I understood that this had not been an impulse. Thursday, August 13th. Practice at 9:15 a.m. Done by roughly noon. Team meetings after. He was clear by about 2:30. No practice Friday the 14th. The Chiefs' published camp schedule had nothing on it. It was a scheduled off day between the last week of camp and the Saturday preseason game. Saturday, August 15th. Kickoff against the Rams at Arrowhead, 3 o'clock. Players report hours before. He needed to be in the building Saturday morning. That gave him from roughly 3 o'clock Thursday afternoon to roughly 9 o'clock Saturday morning. 42 hours. Kansas City to London is about 8.5 hours in the air, and that is not a direct commercial route at a convenient time, so realistically 9 to 10 each way with the ground time on both ends. Take 20 hours out of 42 for travel. That leaves 22 hours in London, of which several are the middle of the night, and several more are getting from an airport into a city. 14 usable hours. He looked at that number and he said yes. I said to him, "Travis, that is insane." And he said, "Mom, it's 14 hours. I said, "That's my point." And my son said, "No, that's my point." He said 14 hours is a whole thing. 14 hours is a Tuesday. People get a whole Tuesday with the person they married, and they don't even notice they had it. He said, I hadn't had 14 consecutive hours with my wife since July 4th. Then he said, I'd have gone for 4. Part 5. What it took. I want to correct something, because I think people imagine this kind of thing is easy for people at that level. Private planes, no problems, done by lunchtime. It is easier than it would be for you or me. I am not going to pretend otherwise. It is not easy. Here is what it actually involved, as best as I understand it, and as Travis described it. 1. He had to tell the team something. He is under contract. He is 36 years old, and coming off a hit that had gone around the internet 6 days earlier. He could not simply vanish for 40 hours during the final week of training camp without a single person in that organization knowing where he was. So he told one person, I do not know who, and he will not say, and I have stopped asking. I have my suspicions, and they are boring. Somebody in the building was told, in confidence, that he had a personal matter and would be back Saturday morning, and that person said, "All right." That is it. That is the whole clearance. A grown man told his employer he had a personal matter on a day he did not have to work. 2. The aircraft. There is a version of this where he charters something on 4 hours' notice, and it costs a genuinely absurd amount of money. That version was available. He did not do that. He got on a plane that was already going. Somebody he knows was flying to Europe on Thursday evening out of a field near Kansas City, and my son asked for a seat, and got one. He told me, "I paid for the fuel difference. Don't ask me what it was." I asked. He said, "Mom." I did not ask again. 3. The security. This is the part I did not think about, and which is, in practice, the hardest part. Taylor Swift does not live in a place you can arrive at. She lives inside an apparatus. There are people whose entire job is knowing who is where and who is coming. You do not turn up unannounced at a door where Taylor Swift is staying, even if you are married to her, because the people at that door are not going to be delighted about it, and there are procedures. So he had to tell them, which meant that the people around his wife knew he was coming before she did. I asked him how that conversation went, and Travis laughed and said, "It went great." He said, "I called somebody and I said, I'm going to be there Friday morning, and I need you to not tell her." He said, and there was a pause, and then she said, "Say that again." He said, and I said it again. And she said, "What time Friday morning?" And he said, "About 6. And she said, 6 in the morning?" And he said, "Yeah." And there was another pause, and then this woman, who has worked for Taylor since 2008, who keeps notebooks, who I have talked about elsewhere, and who I like enormously, she said, "Give me 20 minutes. Part 6. The woman who said yes. I called her, last week, after I found out. I said, "He told me you helped." And she said, "I didn't help. I moved 4 things and lied to one person." I said, "You lied to her?" And she said, "I told her Friday was clear." I said, "Was Friday clear?" And she said, "Friday was not clear. Friday had 2 things on it. One of them I moved to Saturday, and the other one I told the other party had to be pushed a week, and they were annoyed, and I let them be annoyed." I said, "Did she ever find out?" And this woman said, "She found out at about 6:04 in the morning on Friday, same as everybody." Then she said something that I want to include, because it is the part of this that has stayed with me longest. She said, "Donna, I have worked for that woman since she was 18 years old." She said, "I have moved a great many things over the years. I have moved things for record labels and film studios and governments. I have moved things for illness and for grief, and once for something I am not going to tell you about." She said, "I have never once moved something so that somebody could surprise her." I said, "Never?" And she said, "Not once in 18 years. She said, "Nobody has ever tried." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. 18 years. Every arrangement, every schedule, every enormous complicated apparatus, all of it built to get her somewhere on time. And in 18 years, nobody had ever asked to have the machinery pointed the other way. Nobody had ever asked to be a surprise. Because you cannot surprise Taylor Swift. Structurally, practically, you cannot. There are too many people and too many systems, and everything is known in advance by somebody. Unless one of those people decides to help you. And in 18 years, my son was the first person to ask. Part 7. Thursday night. He left the facility Thursday afternoon. He told me he stopped at his house in Leawood for about 20 minutes, which is roughly the amount of time it takes Travis Kelce to pack, because he packs the way he does everything, which is badly and at speed. He said, I brought one bag. I said, what was in it? And he said, honestly, almost nothing. I had like a shirt. Then he said, I brought the thing. I said, what thing? And he said, I'll get to it. He would not tell me. He made me wait until the end of the conversation, the way he has been making me wait for things since he was 5 years old, and I am going to do the same to you, because it is his story and he earned it. He got on the plane at about 7 in the evening Central Time. He said he did not sleep. He said, 8.5 hours, and I did not sleep for 1 minute of it, not one. I said, what did you do? And my son said, I sat there. He said, I had a movie on for a while, and I have absolutely no idea what it was. I could not tell you one thing about it. He said, mostly I kept doing the math again. He said, I kept checking the time and doing the arithmetic again to make sure it worked, like it was going to change. Then he said, and about 2 hours out I got extremely nervous. I said, nervous about what? And Travis Kelce said that she'd be upset. Part 8. The thing he was afraid of. I want to go into this properly because it surprised me, and I think it is the most interesting thing about the entire trip. My son flew across an ocean to see his wife, and for the last 2 hours of the flight he was afraid she would be angry. I said, why on earth would she be angry? And he said, because she's got a whole life over there and I'm just landing in the middle of it. He said, she's working, she's got things, she's got a rhythm going, and I'm about to walk in the door at 6 in the morning and blow the whole day up. He said, and there's a version of this where it's not romantic, it's just a guy who couldn't handle being apart and made it her problem. He said, I've watched people do that to her. I said, do what? And he said, show up. He said, Mom, people show up for her constantly. Everybody wants to be in the room. Everybody's got a reason why they need 20 minutes. He said, and she's the most gracious person alive about it, and every single time it costs her something, and she never says so. He said, and about 2 hours outside London I thought, am I doing that? Am I just another person who showed up? I said, what did you decide? And he said, I decided I'd know in about 4 seconds. He said, because she can't fake it with me. She fakes it with everybody. That's a professional skill. She is extraordinary at it. He said, she cannot do it with me. Her face does a thing. He said, so I figured I'd open the door, and I'd see her face, and I'd know immediately whether I'd done a good thing or a selfish thing. Then he said, and if it was selfish, I was going to say so out loud and get back on the plane. Part 9. 6 in the morning. He landed early Friday morning, London time. He said the drive-in was the longest part of the whole thing. He said, I've flown 8.5 hours, and the 40 minutes in the car nearly killed me. He got there at about 10 to 6, and then he stood outside for about 15 minutes. I said, you stood outside? And he said, yeah. I said, why? And Travis said, because it was 5:50 in the morning, and I thought, what am I doing waking her up? He said, I flew 4,000 miles, and then I stood on a street for 15 minutes trying to work out whether it was rude. The woman with the notebooks was inside. She had been up since 4. She had, in her words, moved 4 things and lied to one person. She told me she watched him on a camera for about 11 of those 15 minutes. She said, he was pacing. She said, I have never seen that man nervous. Not before a Super Bowl. Not at his own wedding. He was emotional at his wedding. He was not nervous. There's a difference. She said, he was pacing on a street in London at 5:50 in the morning, like a 19-year-old. Then she said, and at about 6:02, I decided to end it. I said, how? And she said, I opened the door. She said, she opened the door and looked at him and said, get in here. And he said, Is she up? And she said, she is now, because you've been outside for 15 minutes, and there's a camera. Part 10. The door. Here is where I have to be careful, because what happened in the next few minutes is theirs. I asked Travis to tell me, and he told me, and then I asked if I could tell it, and he said ask her. So I asked her. And Taylor said yes, with 2 conditions, and I have honored both of them, and I am not going to say what they were, because that would defeat the purpose. So this is the version they have both approved. She came out into a hallway. She had been asleep about 90 seconds earlier. She was wearing something she has asked me not to describe. Her hair was doing what hair does at 6 in the morning. And my son was standing there in the clothes he had flown in, which were the clothes he had put on after practice on Thursday, which is to say a t-shirt. And she stopped. She stopped about 8 feet away and did not move. And Travis said, and this is the only line of dialogue from that hallway that I am giving you, and I am giving it to you because he told it to me twice, and both times he got the same look on his face. He said, I've got 14 hours. He said she did not say anything for a moment. And then she started crying, which he said he had expected. And then she started laughing, which he said he had not. And she said, 14? And he said, about 14. And she said, from now. And he said, from now. And she said, okay. And then she said, okay. Okay. What do you want to do? He told me that was the moment. He said, right there, that was it. I said, why? And he said, because she didn't ask me how I did it. He said, she didn't ask about the flight or the schedule or the team or how I got out or whether it was a problem. He said, she said, what do you want to do? He said, she went straight to the 14 hours, 0 seconds of logistics. She just got in. Part 10 and a half, her version. I asked her about the hallway. Not for weeks. I waited until Wednesday of this week, which is the 20th, because there is a difference between asking and taking, and I have been trying to get better at knowing which one I am doing. I said, can I ask you about the door? And she said, which part? And I said, what you thought. She said, I thought something was wrong. I said, what? And she said, Donna, it's 6 in the morning, and somebody wakes you up, and there's a person in your hallway. She said, I did not think my husband has flown across an ocean to surprise me. That is not a thought a person has. That's a thought people have in films. She said, I thought, somebody's dead. I had not considered that, and I should have. She said, I got up and I came out, and I was already doing the thing where you brace. She said, and then it was him. She said, and my brain could not do anything with it for about 2 seconds. Genuinely. Nothing. I was looking directly at my husband, and my brain was going, that's not right, he's in Missouri. Then she said, and then I did the thing I do, which is that I started looking for the reason. I said, what reason? And she said, the bad one. She said, he's here, so something's wrong. Something's happened to somebody. Or, something's happened to him. Or, he's been cut. Or the knee's worse than they said. Or, there's a thing coming out about us in the morning, and he came to tell me in person, she said. I ran about 5 scenarios in 2 seconds, and all 5 of them were bad, she said. Because in my life, unscheduled means bad. She let that sit for a second. Then she said, that's the thing I want you to actually understand, Donna, if you're going to tell this. She said, I have not had an unplanned good thing happen to me in about 15 years. She said, everything good in my life is on a calendar. It's known about. It's arranged. It has a run of show. She said, the only things that arrive unannounced are problems. She said, so I'm standing in a hallway at 6 in the morning, waiting to find out which disaster it is. And she said, and he said, I've got 14 hours. she said, and it took me another 2 seconds. She said, because I still couldn't get there. My brain went, 14 hours until what? She said, and then it landed. She said, he's not here about anything. He's just here. She said she started crying, and she said she was not entirely sure at the time whether it was happy. She said, I think about 40% of it was the adrenaline coming down from 5 disaster scenarios. Then she said, and then I started laughing because I realized how stupid I'd been, and how stupid he must have felt standing on a street for 15 minutes, and how stupid the entire thing was. She said, 2 adults, 4,000 miles, 6 in the morning, a t-shirt. Then she said one more thing. She said, I've had a lot of people do enormous things for me. She said, I want to be careful because I don't want this to sound ungrateful. People have been extraordinarily good to me my whole life. She said, but almost all of it has been arranged. Somebody had an idea, and then somebody's team executed it, and then it happened beautifully. She said, nobody has ever done something for me badly. I said, badly? And Taylor Swift said, he brought one bag with a t-shirt in it. He hadn't slept. He was wearing practice clothes. He stood outside for 15 minutes because he wasn't sure. He gave me a jar he'd dug up in the dark, and he apologized for it being stupid. She said, it was the least produced thing that has ever happened to me. She said, I have never been given anything that wasn't produced. Part 11. What they did. I am going to tell you what they did with 14 hours in London, and I want to warn you in advance that it is not exciting. That is the whole reason I am telling it. They went for a walk. That is the first thing. 6:30 in the morning, before the city was properly awake, with 2 people at a discreet distance, they went for a walk for about an hour. He said, nobody was out. It was unbelievable. It was like the whole place was closed. He said, we just walked around and looked at buildings. I said, what did you talk about? And he said, nothing. Nothing at all. That's not a joke. We genuinely did not talk about anything. I asked about the walk because it is the part of the 14 hours that could most easily have gone wrong. Taylor Swift walking around London at 6:30 in the morning is not a small operation, and there were 2 people at a distance, and there were decisions made about route. I said, weren't you terrified? And she said, no. She said, at 6:30 in the morning, in that part of the city, there is genuinely nobody. It's the 1 hour. If you want to be a person in London, you have about 90 minutes, and then it's over. Then she said, we did get seen once. I said, seen? And she said, one man. She said, we were walking, and there was a man coming the other way with a dog. He was about 60. He had a coat on over what was clearly pajamas. She said, and he clocked us, both of us. I watched it happen on his face. She said, he did the double take, and then he did the thing where the second take is longer than the first, and then he did the arithmetic. I said, what did he do? And Taylor said, he nodded. I said, that's it? And she said, that's it. He nodded at us, once, like you'd nod at anybody on a street at 6:30 in the morning, and then he kept walking with his dog. She said, he did not take a photograph. He did not say anything. He did not stop. She said, he saw Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce on an empty street in London at 6:30 in the morning, and he decided it was none of his business. She was quiet for a second. And then she said, I think about that man a lot. She said, I don't know his name, and I never will, and he has no idea what he did. She said, he gave me a completely normal morning, and it cost him a photograph he could have sold. Then she said, whoever you are, sir, thank you. I told Travis about that afterward. He had not thought about it at all. He said, the guy with the dog? I said, yes. And Travis said, oh, he was great. He nodded. I said, Taylor's been thinking about him for a week. And my son said, really? And I said, yes. And he said, Hooler. which is not a word. He made a noise. That is the closest I can spell it. Then he said, I just thought, guy with a dog. And that is, honestly, the entire difference between those two people in one exchange. One of them met a man on a street and thought, guy with a dog. The other one met a man on a street and understood that she had just been handed something rare by a stranger in pajamas who will never know he did it. Neither of them is wrong, but only one of them notices what things cost. Then they went back and she made breakfast. I want to point at that. She has been at the center of an apparatus for 18 years. There is somebody who can produce food. She made breakfast, herself, in a kitchen, at about 8 in the morning, for her husband who had just crossed an ocean. He said, "It was eggs. It was just eggs, Mom." He said, "It was the best food I've had in my life." Then he slept for 4 hours. I laughed out loud when he told me this, and he got quite defensive about it. He said, "I had not slept in 29 hours. I said, "You flew 4,000 miles and slept for 4 of your 14 hours. And he said, "Mom, I slept in the same room as my wife for the first time in 6 weeks. That's the whole point." Then he said, more quietly, "I slept like I was dead. I have not slept like that since June." She did not sleep. She told me this later, and she told it like it was nothing. She said, "I stayed up." I said, "The whole 4 hours?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Doing what?" And Taylor Swift said, "Watching him sleep, mostly." Which I know is a thing people say in songs, and it sounds ridiculous. She said, "But he'd been in a dormitory for 4 weeks on a bed that's 8 inches too short for him, and he was in an actual bed, and he was completely out, and his face was—" She stopped. She said, "He just looked like a person. He didn't look like anything else. He just looked like a man asleep." She said, "I hadn't seen that in 6 weeks, and I didn't want to miss any of it." He woke up at about 2 in the afternoon. They had the rest of the day. They watched something. He would not say what, and neither would she, and I have concluded it is embarrassing. They talked for about 3 hours. He said, "Real talking, not phone talking." He said, "On the phone you've got a subject. You call and there's a thing you're calling about, even if the thing is nothing, and you can hear the pauses." He said, "In a room there's no pauses. There's just time." He said, "We talked about her sister-in-law, and about my dad, and about the knee, and about whether we should get a dog, and about a book she'd read, and about my brother's new job, and about 100 things I have completely forgotten." I got 1 piece of the 3 hours out of him, and only because I asked the same question 4 different ways. I said, "What's the one bit you remember?" And he said, "The dog thing." I said, "You actually talked about getting a dog?" And he said, "For like 40 minutes. I want to tell you about this because it is the most ordinary thing in this entire story, and I think it is the reason he went. They have 3 cats between them and 1 dog, and there has been, apparently, an ongoing negotiation. He said, "I want another dog." She thinks 4 animals is a lot. I said, 4 animals is a lot. And he said, "Mom, don't take her side, that's not what this is." He said they went through the whole thing. Breed, size. Who would actually walk it? What happens during the season? What happens if he retires and is suddenly home all the time? Which he pointed out would make him the obvious person to have a dog. He said, and about 30 minutes in, she said something, and I've been thinking about it since. I said, "What?" And Travis said, she said, "We're not deciding this now, we're deciding it when we live somewhere." He said, and that stopped me. He said, "Because we don't live somewhere." He said, "We have houses. We have several. She's got places, and I've got places, and we've got a place together." He said, "We have never lived somewhere." I said, "What did you say?" And he said, I said, "When?" And she said, "When you're done." He said the room went quiet. He said, "Not bad quiet." She wasn't pushing. She has never once in 3 years said anything about football ending. He said, "She just said it like it's a real thing that's going to happen, and we both know it." He said, "When you're done, we'll live somewhere, and then we'll get a dog." He said, and I sat there and thought, that's the whole rest of my life in one sentence, and she just said it about a dog. Then he said something that I did not expect at all. He said, "Mom, I've been scared about the end of this." He said, "Not the football. I've made my peace with the football, whenever it comes." He said, "The after." He said, "I've watched guys go through it. I watched Jason go through it, and he had a wife and 4 kids, and a whole other career waiting, and it was still hard." He said, "And I've been thinking, what's the after look like for me?" And then he said, "And on Friday, I found out it looks like a house with a dog in it." He said, "That's what I went for. That's the whole thing. I went 4,000 miles for 3 hours of forgetting what we talked about." Part 12. The Thing in the Bag. Now I will tell you what was in the bag. He gave it to her at about 6 in the evening, 12 hours in, 2 hours before he had to leave. He said, "I didn't want to do it at the start because then the whole day is about the thing." It was a jar. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I did. Travis Kelce flew 4,000 miles with one bag containing a t-shirt and a jar. Here is what was in the jar. Grass. From the practice fields at Missouri Western State University in St. Joseph, Missouri. I said, "Travis." And he said, "Hang on." He said, "It's not as stupid as it sounds." I said, "It is exactly as stupid as it sounds." And he said, "Okay, it's exactly as stupid as it sounds." And then he told me why, and I stopped talking. He said, "This might be my last camp." He said, "I don't know. Nobody knows. I haven't decided, and I'm not going to decide until I decide." He said, "But it might be." He said, "And there's a thing that happens on the last day. On the 20th, the last practice, everybody knows it's the last one of the summer, and there's a feeling." He said, and I was standing on that grass on the 13th thinking, if this is it, then in about a week I'm going to walk off this field for the last time, and nobody's going to say anything, and I'm just going to get in a car. He said, 14 years I've been going to that place. 16 for the team. He said, she's never seen it. He said, she's never been to St. Joe. She's never seen the fields, or the dorm, or the cafeteria, or any of it. She's seen stadiums. Everybody sees stadiums. He said, the stadium isn't the job. The job is a grass field in Missouri in July. He said, so I took some. He said he did it the night before he left. Thursday evening, after meetings, before he drove to Leawood. He went back out to the practice fields in the dark by himself with a jar, and he dug up a handful of grass and dirt and put the lid on. He said, I felt like an idiot doing it. He said, I stood there in the dark with a jar like a complete lunatic. I asked him what he said when he gave it to her, and he said, I said, this is where I've been. Part 13. What she did with it. She called me on Monday the 17th, 3 days after. I did not know yet. I did not find out until the following day, when I asked my son a question about something else, and got 4 seconds of silence. So on the 17th, when she called me, I had no idea what she was talking about for the first 30 seconds of the conversation. She said, Donna, did you know about the jar? I said, what jar? And she said, oh. And I said, what jar, Taylor? And she said, I've made a mistake. She would not tell me. She said it was his to tell, and she was not going to take it from him, and she was right, and I was extremely annoyed about it for 24 hours. But she did say one thing before she got off the phone, and she said it in a voice I have heard from her exactly twice. She said, I've been given a lot of things. She said, I want you to know that I understand what I've been given, and that I have never in my life been given anything like that. And then she said she had to go, and she hung up. I found out from Travis the next day. And after he told me, after the whole thing, the flight and the door and the 14 hours and the jar, I called her back. I said, I know about the jar now. And she said, good. And I said, what did you do with it? She said, it's in a case. I said, a case? And she said, I had somebody look at how to keep it. It's organic material, it'll break down, and I wanted to know if there was a way to keep it that doesn't turn into a jar of dead grass in 8 months. She said, apparently there is. It involves drying it a specific way and then sealing it. She said, it's being done properly. Then she said, Donna, do you know what he actually gave me? And I said, I think so. And she said, no, I don't think you do. I've been thinking about it for a week. She said, he gave me the part nobody gets. She said, I've been to the stadium. I've been in the family box. I've been photographed at Arrowhead more times than I can count, and every single one of those times I was at the thing that everybody sees. She said, I have never once been where he actually works. She said, 14 years of his life happened on a grass field in Missouri in July, and I have never stood on it, and I never will, because by the time I could, it'll be over. Long pause. And she said, so he brought it. And then she said the thing that made me put the phone down for a second and pick it back up. She said, my whole life people have given me access to things. She said, I have been given keys to cities. I have been backstage everywhere there is a backstage. She said, nobody has ever given me the inside of their own life. Part 14. 8 o'clock. He left at 8 in the evening London time. 14 hours. Almost exactly. He said the goodbye was bad. I asked him to describe it, and he said, no. I said, at all? And he said, it was bad, Mom. It was the worst part of the whole thing, and I'm not going to do it as a story. I said, all right? And he said, I'll tell you one thing. He said, she walked me to the door, and then she came outside, and it's a whole thing for her to come outside. There's an entire operation involved in that woman standing on a pavement. He said, and she stood there while the car pulled off. He said, and I turned around and looked out the back, and she was still standing there. He said, and I thought, that's my wife. He said, I've said that word maybe 400 times since July, and that's the first time it did anything to me. He was in the air by 9:30. He landed in Kansas City at roughly 1 in the morning Central Time on Saturday, August 15th. He was at Arrowhead by 9. Kickoff was at 3. Part 15. The Ring. Now, August 15th. Arrowhead Stadium. Chiefs vs. Rams. Preseason Week 1. Mahomes not playing. Stafford not playing. A 3 o'clock afternoon game in the Missouri heat that meant nothing to anybody. Travis did not play. He stood on the sideline in uniform for about 3 hours, in the sun, on roughly 4 hours of sleep across 2 days and 18 hours of flying. And he had his wedding ring on. I want to explain why that is unusual, because I know that if you do not follow football, it might sound like nothing. Players do not wear rings during game activity. It is not a rule in the sense of a written prohibition for a non-participating player on a sideline. It is a practical thing. Hands get caught. Fingers get broken. Every equipment person in America will tell you to take it off. Travis has never worn a ring on a field before. He was not married before, but he has never worn anything on his hands on a field, ever, in 14 years, and there are 700 photographs to prove it. On August 15th, he stood on that sideline with a gold band on his left hand and did not take it off for 3 hours. And the cameras found it inside about 4 minutes. I texted him that night. I wrote, I saw the ring. And he wrote back, I'm not taking it off. I wrote, at all? And he wrote, Mom, I'm not taking it off. That is the entire exchange. I have it screenshotted. I have shown it to 4 people. And at the time, on the night of August 15th, I thought it was very sweet, and I thought I understood it completely. I did not understand it at all. Because here is what I now know, which I did not know then. 31 hours earlier, that ring had been on his hand in a hallway in London at 6 o'clock in the morning, while his wife stood 8 feet away and did not move. 20 hours earlier, it had been on his hand when he handed her a jar of grass and said, This is where I've been. 7 hours earlier, it had been on his hand when a car pulled away from a pavement and he turned around to look out the back window. And then he stood on a football field in Missouri in front of 70,000 people with that ring on his finger, and every camera in the building found it, and every single person who wrote about it that night wrote, How sweet, Newlyweds, he can't bear to take it off. They were not wrong. They were just about 4% right. Part 16, How I Found Out. Sunday, August 16th. No practice. I called him about something completely unrelated. I do not even remember what. Something about Ed, or about a thing at the house. And in the middle of it I said, You looked wrecked yesterday. And he said, Yeah, long week. And I said, You looked like you hadn't slept in 3 days. And there were 4 seconds of silence. 4 seconds. I have been this man's mother for 36 years. He has never once successfully lied to me, and he has never once managed a pause without giving something away. I said, Travis. And he said, What? And I said, Where were you on Friday? And he said, At camp. And I said, There was no practice Friday. And he said, I know. And I said, Travis Michael. He caved in about 11 seconds, which is roughly his personal record for holding out under a middle name. He told me the whole thing on Tuesday the 18th, over about an hour and 40 minutes, and I asked approximately 200 questions, and by the end of it I was sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against a cupboard, which is a thing I have done perhaps 3 times in my adult life. I said, at the end, Does Jason know? And he said, Yeah. I said, How does Jason know? And he said, Somebody had to be able to answer a phone. Part 17. Jason's Night. I called Jason on the 19th. He was in Missouri that day. I have told that story elsewhere. He made a surprise appearance at camp on the 19th, ate an ice cream bar, watched his brother have the best practice of the summer. I said, You knew about London. And Jason said, Ah. And I said, Yes, ah. He told me his part. He said Travis called him on the Wednesday the 12th. He said, He called me and said, I need you to have your phone on Friday. And Jason said, For what? And Travis said, Just have it on. And Jason said, Travis, for what? And Travis said, I'm going to England. Jason said he sat down. He said, Kylie was in the room. I sat down and she looked at me and mouthed, What? And I mouthed, England. And she said, What? Out loud. He said, So that's how Kylie knows. 9 hours. It was not even 9 hours. It was 9 seconds. I said, What did you say to him? And Jason said, I said, Is this a good idea? And Travis said, No. And Jason said, Okay. Have you got a way back? And Travis said, Yeah. And Jason said, Then go. I said, That's it? And Jason Kelce said, Mom, what was I going to say? He said, A man wants to see his wife. He said, I've been retired 2 years, and I've spent a decent chunk of it thinking about all the times I didn't go somewhere because of a schedule. He said, Nobody ever got to the end of their life and thought, I'm glad I stayed for the walkthrough. Then he said the thing that I want to keep. He said, also, Mom, he's 36. He said, this might be it. This might be the last camp, and the last season, and the last everything, and then he's got the rest of his life with that woman, and none of this ever again. He said, and I know exactly what that transition looks like, because I did it 2 years ago, and it is a lot harder than anybody says. He said, whatever he was doing on Friday, he was practicing. I said, practicing what? And Jason said, being married to her without football in the way. He said, he's got about 6 months to figure out how to be a person, and he just took a 14-hour test run. Part 18. What Kylie said. Kylie called me on the 20th, unprompted, which she does not do. She said, has he told you? I said, on Tuesday. And Kylie said, what did you think? And I said, I sat on my kitchen floor. And Kylie Kelce said, yeah. Then she said, can I tell you the part that got me? I said, yes. And she said, it wasn't the flight. She said, the flight is a grand gesture. Grand gestures are easy. Grand gestures are for the person doing them as much as the person receiving them. She said, it was the 15 minutes on the pavement. She said, he flew 4,000 miles and then stood outside for 15 minutes, wondering if he was being inconsiderate. She said, that's not a grand gesture. That's the opposite. That's a man who flew across an ocean and then worried he was imposing. She said, I've been married 11 years, Donna. I would trade every grand gesture I have ever received for one man standing outside a door, worrying about whether he's welcome. Then she said, don't tell Jason I said that. And I said, I'm going to put it on the internet. And she said, fine. Part 19. What it cost. I want to be honest about the other side of this, because I do not want to leave you with the idea that this was free. He was destroyed. He stood on that sideline for 3 hours on August 15th on almost no sleep. He got through it. He went home, and by his own account, slept for 11 hours, and woke up on Sunday and could not entirely remember Saturday. On Monday the 17th he practiced. On Tuesday he practiced. On Wednesday the 19th he had the best practice of camp, the one Jason watched, the one Andy Reid mentioned. So it worked out. But there was a version of that weekend where he tweaked something on a Saturday sideline on 4 hours of sleep, and it turned into a story about a 36-year-old veteran being unavailable in week 1. He knew that. I asked him if he had thought about it. And he said, yeah. I said, and, Travis said, and I decided the risk was that I get tired, and the risk on the other side was that my wife spends a whole night awake in another country, and I do nothing about it twice. He said, I did nothing the first time. On the 7th, I did nothing. He said, I wasn't going to do nothing twice. Part 19 and a half. What Ed said. I told Ed on the Tuesday night, about an hour after I got off the phone with Travis. I was still on the kitchen floor when he came in, which alarmed him considerably. He said, what happened? And I said, nothing bad. Sit down. And I told him the whole thing. It took about 15 minutes because I kept having to stop. Ed Kelce listened to all of it without saying one word. When I finished, he sat there for a while, and then he said, the grass. I said, what? And he said, he took the grass. I said, I know, it's the strangest part. And Ed said, no, it isn't. He said, Donna, do you remember the box? And I said, what box? And my husband said, 1989, the garage, the box. And then I did remember, and I had not thought about it in probably 30 years. When Ed stopped coaching in 1989, and I have told a version of this elsewhere, and I am not going to go through the whole thing again, when it ended, he cleared out. And he came home with a box. I remember the box being in the garage for years. I remember moving it twice. I remember, at some point in the 90s, asking him whether we could get rid of it, and him saying no, in a tone that ended the conversation. I said, "What was in it?" And Ed said, "Whistles, 2 clipboards, a rock." I said, "A rock?" And Ed Kelce said, "From the field." I sat on my kitchen floor at 73 years old and looked at my husband. I said, "You took a rock?" And he said, "I took a rock." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I stood on that field for a long time, and then one day I wasn't going to anymore, and nobody says anything, and you just get in the car." He said, "I wanted something from the actual place. Not a picture of it. The place." I said, "Ed, why have you never told me that?" And he said, "You never asked what was in the box." Which is entirely true, and which I have been sitting with for a week. Then he said, "It's still out there." I said, "The box?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Is the rock still in it?" And Ed said, "Obviously the rock is still in it. Where would the rock go?" We went out to the garage. It took 20 minutes because that garage is a disgrace, and I have been meaning to deal with it since about 2011. The box was there, under 2 other boxes, cardboard, soft with age, the top folded over the way you fold a box when you do not intend to open it. Whistles, 2 clipboards, and a rock about the size of a plum, dark gray, entirely ordinary. Ed picked it up and turned it over once and put it back. He said, "Still there." And he closed the box. I want to say something about that, because it is the single strangest thing that has happened to me this year. My son, 36 years old, flew 4,000 miles with a jar of grass from a practice field in Missouri because he thought his wife should have the place and not the picture of the place. He has never heard the story about the box. He was born in October of 1989. He was not alive for any of it. Ed has never told either of those boys about that rock, and they did the same thing 37 years apart. I asked Ed about it afterward. I said, "How does that happen?" And my husband thought about it for a while. And he said, "It doesn't. It's not a thing that passes down." He said, "It's just that anybody who's stood somewhere for long enough wants to take a piece of it, and most people don't because they think it's stupid." He said, "And some people do it anyway." Then he said, "He did it anyway. That's the part that's mine." Part 20. What I actually think it was. I have had a week with this, and I want to tell you what I have concluded, because I have changed my mind about what this story is. For the first 2 days, I thought it was a romantic story. Man flies across ocean for wife. 14 hours. A jar of grass. That is a lovely story, and I would have been happy to tell it. It is not what happened. Here is what happened. A man who has spent his entire adult life inside a schedule that does not care about him, found a 40-hour gap in it, and used the gap. That is all. That is genuinely all. There was no permission and there was no reward, and nobody was going to know. The whole point was that nobody was going to know. He was not building anything, and he was not proving anything, and there was no photograph. He found a gap, and he used it. I want to say something to the people listening who are my age. I am 73 years old. I have been married for a very long time. I have had a great many gaps. I did not use most of them. I want to be honest about that because I have told a story in another one of these videos about a job I turned down in 1989 without telling my husband, and people were very kind about it, and I do not want to leave the impression that the only thing I ever failed to do was the big one. The truth is, I failed at the small ones constantly. There were weekends. There were afternoons. There were 40-hour gaps all over my 30s and 40s, and I filled almost every single one of them with things that had to be done. Because things always have to be done. That is the nature of things. They present themselves as compulsory, and they are almost never compulsory, and you find that out about 30 years too late. My son had a 40-hour gap, and he spent it in a hallway at 6 in the morning saying, "I've got 14 hours." I would like the record to show that I did not teach him that. He learned that somewhere else, and I do not entirely know where, and I am extremely proud of him. Part 21. Where we are now. Today is August 22nd. Camp ended on the 20th. My son played in Tampa last night against the Buccaneers. Roster cuts are on the 30th. The season starts next month. The last time Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift were in the same room was for 14 hours on Friday, August 14th, in London. They have not seen each other since. They will not see each other again until the second week of September. That is another 3 weeks. I talked to her on Thursday. I said, "Are you all right?" And she said, "I'm better than I was." I said, "Because of the 14 hours?" And she said, "Yes." Then she said something that I want to end this on. She said, "It didn't fix the distance." She said, "He came and he left, and it's exactly the same as it was. It's the same number of miles and the same number of days. Nothing about the situation changed." She said, "What changed is that I know he'll come." She said, "I didn't know that before. I assumed it, the way you assume things about somebody you love, but I hadn't seen it." She said, "Now I've seen it." She said, "And the next 3 weeks are completely different because of a Friday." Part 22. For the people listening, I want to say one thing before I finish, and it is for the women my age, because I know who is out there. You are not going to fly to London. I want to be clear about that. I am not standing in a kitchen in Cleveland, Ohio, telling 70-year-old women to make grand romantic gestures across oceans. That is not the lesson, and my son would be embarrassed if it were. Here is the lesson. Somebody in your life is standing on a pavement right now, wondering if they would be imposing. That is the whole thing. That is what I took out of this. The flight is not the story. The jar is not the story, as much as I love the jar. The story is 15 minutes on a pavement. A man crossed 4,000 miles and then stood outside a door and could not make himself knock because he could not be certain he was wanted, because nobody is ever completely certain they are wanted, not at 36 and not at 73. There is somebody who has not called you in a while, and you have probably decided something about why. I want to suggest, on the basis of a week of thinking about a 15-minute pause on a London street, that there is a reasonable chance they are standing on a pavement. Not literally, metaphorically. They have got their hand halfway to the phone, and they are doing the arithmetic about whether they would be imposing, and they have been doing that arithmetic for 11 months. Open the door! That is what a woman with a notebook did at 6:02 in the morning on August 14th. She watched a man pace on a camera for 11 minutes, and then she decided to end it. She did not wait for him to knock. She opened the door and said, "Get in here." She is the reason this story exists. Not the flight, not the plan. A woman who had been up since 4 decided that 11 minutes of a grown man pacing was enough. If somebody in your life has gone quiet, consider that they might be pacing. Open the door. Say, "Get in here." You will find out in about 4 seconds whether you were right, and I promise you the 4 seconds cost less than the 11 months. I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. On August 15, 2026, my son stood on a football field in Missouri with a gold ring on his hand, and 70,000 people looked at it, and every camera found it, and a great many kind people wrote a great many kind things about Newlyweds. They were right. They were about 4% right. 31 hours earlier, that ring had been on his hand in a hallway 4,000 miles away, at 6 o'clock in the morning, while a woman stood 8 feet from him and did not move. He said, "I've got 14 hours. And she said, "What do you want to do?" That is what you were looking at. Thank you for sitting with me today.